Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Tonight it is the 3rd of September and we're looking at updates over the past 48 hours, specifically around Vuhledar, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and the Kursk offensive where the Ukrainians have made some advances of notes. We'll also, of course, cover at the end the Poltava missile strikes. And so just to begin, we're going to zoom in on this new vector that was activated by the Russian forces along this highway west of Pavlivka, with the Russian forces capturing a territory amounting to 15.6 square kilometers, entering into a large portion of this village, Prachistivka, which has been under Ukrainian control really for a very long time, just south of the Kashtahach River. The river, I'm going to mark it for you guys in red over here, so just see how close it is and how it's located on the southern bank. And that does play a role in why the Russians are confident in taking control over it, because the Ukrainians do not have a large density of forces in this corridor. I don't know how wide it is, but there's this corridor in between Vuhledar and Velika Novosilka, and it spans around maybe 27 kilometers. And there's just a lack of Ukrainian forces here that is unparalleled when you compare it to any other part of the front line in Donetsk. And this is an area that, of course, the Russians could divert a small portion of their forces or utilize the ones that are already located generally here. You can see some of them on my map, and advance and take over general open fields, trenches, whatever it may be, including villages along the road to an area like Velika Novosilka. That is one objective that you can see very clearly based on the highway that leads into the southeastern parts of that town. And when we're looking at the situation in Velika Novosilka over the past few days, NASA's fire map has actually shown a lot of fires, a huge accumulation in the region surrounding the town. Now, NASA's firms is not the most accurate in terms of specific locations, but it does give us a general idea of trends. And the trend that we're seeing is just a massive uptick in fires, probably due to shelling in this region west of Velika Novosilka, but also nearby, and also in other rear villages. You can't even call them rear because they're so close to the front line, but they haven't been affected as much as of yet. You can see them on the map like Shakhtarske, Novyukrainka, even Uspanivka. And so the Russians have really upticked the amount of barrel artillery over the past few days, in addition to airstrikes. Airstrikes are back to the pre-Kursk offensive levels in a lot of Donbass, especially here. It's actually higher than it has been in a really long time when it comes to air sorties in the region around Vuhledar. And a lot of the shelling, for instance, has been documented by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade towards the high rises that have still not collapsed, at least their skeletons haven't, in the town itself. So definitely there is a Russian uptake in attacks here, trying to target Ukrainian reinforcements that may be arriving, targeting logistical centers like Velika Novosilka and the roads that are branching out of it, targeting any retreating forces, for instance. That's another objective. And again, when we're looking at Prachistivka and Zolota Niva, they're along this particular road and they're south of a rather important river. It's just important because it's a natural barrier that's near the front line. But in terms of its actual shallowness and the fact that it's very narrow, it's very easy to cross over, whether it be a Ukrainian, for instance, but now because it's so close to the front line, it's more difficult, or even for the Russians that are trying to cross over. There's a potential scenario where they could actually take over the villages to the south of the river and cross over, take over an area like Novoyukrainka. That would be the logical next step. You can see how there's a paved road going nearly vertically all the way across the river into Novoyukrainka, and this would be a big fear for the Ukrainians because in this process, the Russians will be able to take over a really highly elevated village. And just to give some context for this, Vuhledar is a part of a really large ridge that extends in the southeastern direction into Russian-controlled territory. But then also, if you're looking at the Ukrainian side, goes in the northwestern direction all the way into an area like Novoyukrainka, and then from there branches off, with the ridge continuing in the northern direction and then also in the western direction. And so it's very important for the Russians to take control over it. It would give them, of course, a new access to attack Bohoyavlenka, but also just overlook it because Bohoyavlevka is very important when it comes to being a local command hub, and a lot of roads branch out of it, but also it's on very low elevation. Same thing with Velika Novosilka. Having these positions to the east would open up a new vector of attack, as opposed to only advancing directly from village to village in an area like Uruzhenia, Makarivka, which is a really drawn out process, but then having this eastern attack would really help envelop the Ukrainian forces and put additional pressure onto them. So that's just some of the thinking behind the Russian advance over here. And of course, it could even be related to Vuhledar. As we're zooming in, we talked about in the previous video the Russian advance across the highway, entering into the Yuzhno-Donbasskaya mine. This occurred on September 1st, and we have video of the BMP dismounting infantry in the mine's administrative building. Since then, Ukrainian sources have confirmed that there has been no change in the fighting, as in the Russians have still maintained control in these facilities, and the Ukrainians have failed to push them back. At the same time, the Ukrainians are resisting mainly around the Slag Keep, and it's very clear why. They don't want to lose control over this really important vantage point, which not only overlooks, or at least is on level terms with Vuhledar, but also, of course, overlooks all of the fields leading in and out of it. So that would be so important for not just a withdrawal, but also for the current defense. And just to the west, if we're looking at it, or east, I should say, Avodiane, Ukrainian sources have not indicated a Russian advance, but they have shown a change in the gray zone as the Ukrainian forces are forced to abandon large swaths of territory, including tree lines and fields just west of this highway that the Russians have secured control over. That's also due to Russian shelling, but also forays and DRG operations. So the Ukrainians now do have a confirmed presence, at least in this western region, including the plantation, the warehouses, some of these residential areas, and then to the east, the Pivnaya Donbasskaya mine. They still control that one. And so, of course, when you're looking at the Russian attack vector over here occurring along another ridge or advancing directly through it, it has significance not only in the hopes of enveloping an area like Vuhledar from the northeast, but also for getting control over highly elevated positions leading into the valley of Bohoyavlenka, which is really just an obvious next target following the fall of an area like Vuhledar. And just one final word about this town, we still are not aware of confirmation surrounding the withdrawal of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade from this theater, because for a while now, rumors have circulated that the 72nd Brigade has been replaced by the 110th Brigade, and the 72nd has been moved to Selidova to defend over there, and that the 110th has been moved from the area north of Pokrovsk to defend in the region that is located just within Vuhledar. It's important to note that the 110th serves the role in a lot of cases of being the vanguard as other forces withdraw from a particular area. So they act as a final fighting retreat. They did so in Avdiivka, holding the line in the flanks in the city itself as other units withdrew. And if the rumors were to be true, then you could see something similar happen in Vuhledar. But I have to stress that we haven't seen proof of that, which is why I have not changed the location of either of those two units. Now, to go north, we're going to look at the Pokrovsk front. And just as a general theme, over the past few days, there has been a relative stabilization in the front line. What this means is that the Russian advances have not evaporated. There are still Russian advances that occur at a smaller scale. But just when you compare it to the huge amounts of square kilometers that are taken over by the Russians over the past month and a half on a daily basis, every day I was churning out videos talking about large fields taken over, villages every day being captured without much of a fight. And that was just a reflection of the situation that the Ukrainians were in, where they were surprised and flanked from the north. They were just totally unprepared for it, unorganized, and lacking the manpower to hold on to trenches and houses in the Russians' way. And so the Russian momentum, of course, manifested. And now it's reached a point where the Russians are not necessarily overextended, but they have advanced really deep into the Ukraine rear over a extended period of time, and that leads to fatigue, and it leads to a need for rotation and regrouping. And so then naturally the fighting does decrease in terms of the amount of territory captured, and then the Ukrainians also have time during that period to send in additional forces, which is what we're going to get to in a second. So the Ukrainians have moved in reinforcements, and a lot of the focal points of the fighting have reached urban areas, which also drags up the fighting even more. So that's just some of the rationale behind why the pace of advances has decreased significantly. And it could, of course, change depending on how long it takes the Russians to increase their readiness and advance deeper into the Ukrainian line. But just as an example, here in Halytsinivka, we know the Russians captured this village a couple of days ago, and now we have this video from the 119th Territorial Defense Brigade. This is a unit that has not operated at the front line for over a year and a half. I have not recalled any incident of them being involved in fighting since early 2023 when they fought along the northern flank of Bakhmut, which has been so much time since then, but probably they were decimated during that fighting and had to be totally reconstituted. So it's like introducing a totally new brigade into the fighting. And what that means is also the sort of caliber here is probably very low quality, as you're looking at probably conscripts being moved in, especially given the fact it's a territorial defense brigade. So it really shows the Ukrainian priorities that of all the units they could have selected to be moved to help stabilize the front line along the Vapsha River, along Ukrainsk, they selected a unit that had not had any previous experience fighting in this region, hadn't fought at all for over a year and a half, and which is consisting of elements that aren't properly, don't have the same level of training, I would say, as elite Ukrainian units. And I'm making that comparison because they could have theoretically moved in troops from the Kursk offensive. They could have moved in a lot of elite units that are currently operating over there to help close these gaps over here that the Russians are exploiting. But they made the conscious decision to keep the Ukrainian forces that are considered to be of the highest caliber attacking or defending in Kursk, and then move in whatever remnants are left of the rear, whether it be new units that are being created or old units that are being reconstituted to help close the gaps. And so that's what we're seeing over here. It's a reflection of Ukrainian policy. And you can see based on this video that their 166th Battalion conducted mortar shelling of Russian soldiers and houses in this southwestern part of the village along the road that would lead into the Ukrainian positions currently in Zhelana Pershe. But for now, the line has sort of stabilized as the Russians have crossed over the river and have to conduct combing operations before advancing any deeper. The Ukrainians, at the same time, they are claiming that they've been able to repel numerous assaults towards Lysivka, which appears to be correct because no Russian source has been able to substantiate the claim that Lysivka is captured, and a lot of them actually are saying that it has not been taken over by the Russian forces, that it's only a gray zone. And so for now, I'm keeping it under Ukrainian control, but it is imperative that the Ukrainians maintain control over its entirety, because losing it would then give access to the Russians from a very close quarters to advance through the eastern flank and, of course, take over the duplexes and mine nearby. But at the same time, Russian sources today, they reiterated that they are continuing to advance directly north of Ukrainsk through open fields and these horizontal tree lines that you see marked with these arrows. But so far, I can't really change the situation over here in terms of the front line. And same thing with Selidove. I can't make any change to the front line, even though Russian sources have been adamant that they've been able to capture this local hospital in southern Selidove. I'll mark it with an X, the area that many Russian sources are claiming to have captured in recent days. And it does seem logical, for instance, that the Russian forces would be able to send in DRGs through this rural area west of Mikhailivka, an area that the Ukrainians definitely don't have the wherewithal to hold on to house by house. So they've withdrawn into the center of Selidove, into its nucleus. And then from there, use the Centralna Road and Berehova Road to actually branch out and into this district. That is something that is very plausible. It's just something that I haven't seen confirmation of through video footage or Ukrainian reporting. But for now, just keep in mind that there is a very high possibility that the Russians are operating here and that it could give them an option to advance deeper into southern Selidove and then also put pressure onto the nucleus of Selidove, as I refer to it, with this massive citadel area that is serving as a region for Ukrainians to regroup and for new reinforcements to arrive and hold a solid line, because that is their hope. Their hope now is that the Russians will run out of steam and the reinforcements will be sufficient in order to hold on to Ukrainsk, Lysivka, and Selidove for an extended period of time. Now, just to look a bit to the north at an area like Novohordivka, the Russians focused for about a week plus on consolidating control over the nearby areas, whether it be the perimeter, tree lines, fields, plantations, all of that. And so by now, the Russian sources and Ukrainians agree that they've completed this operation. And so there is a question as to whether the Russians were able to take over this mine over here. Some Ukrainian sources claim they've been able to hold back attacks over here. And then there's also ambiguity about Mariinivka as to whether the Ukrainians are still here, despite being in a really compromised position. But we do know generally the Russians have completed their combing operations around Novohordivka, which means that now whatever forces are here, if they're not really in a process of resting or rotating, and then they do have the ability to look northwards and expand their horizons. That could involve Chasiv Yar, Krasny Yar, advancing through this rail axis. That's also a possibility. The thing is, the Ukrainians have reported that they've been able to repel numerous assaults onto Krasny Yar and onto Hordivka in recent days. And just based on the lack of footage and the lack of reporting coming from this area, it does seem to indicate that the Ukrainians have been able to, at least temporarily, stabilize the line around this sort of semicircle that you see marked over here with these yellow trenches that were built a while ago over the past year, but really over the past few weeks, the Ukrainians were forced to beef them up with additional troops and try to expand them to the best of their ability. But of course, they did not have enough time to do that to any large scale. But whatever they do have in their quiver, they're trying to use to defend over here. And for over like 2 weeks now, they've been able to hold a solid line of defense along here. The question is, once the Russians begin to solidify control and finish with their sort of readiness, will there be gaps found in the line which end up allowing the Russians to cross over and begin knocking on the doorstep of Murad, or at the very least its southern suburbs, because that's a very pertinent fear. And by then, the final line of defense, if you're looking at it, would be the outwards perimeter of Pokrovsk from the east. That would be the final one. And by then, you'd be at the immediate surroundings of said city. So it's very important for the Ukrainians to reinforce their line here and hold on to it despite whatever attritional costs it may come with. Looking at Toretsk, the battle here is continuing to progress, albeit at a lesser pace than previously. Because again, we're all looking in relative terms, because earlier in August, the Russians, of course, were advancing at a significant pace, whether it be through New York or through the eastern suburbs of Toretsk. Now, what we see is the Ukrainians consolidating around the Jabalka suburb to the south, around the heartland of Toretsk, including the citadel and a lot of massive industrial enterprises. And even in the hinterlands, where the Russians have been able to advance, the line has sort of stalled around this slag heap over here in this penitentiary. But the Russians have continued their slow but steady advances along the highway axis. This is the one area they're continuing to advance through, and took over in recent days 2.3 square kilometers, advancing through this garage area, some residential buildings, and reaching all the way very, very close to some warehouses. If we're measuring it, they're only about, if I'm going to look at it here, very, very close to the outskirts of the citadel area, not by much. So, of course, on its own, this is concerning, just being 600 meters away from the core of the Ukrainian defense over here. But that's not the end of it, because at the same time, the Russian forces have been able to capture the entirety of Druzhba. This is a northeastern suburb of Toretsk, and what we see is that it's located along a rail line, which now the Russians will have access to, including its 2 windbreaks. Now, using those windbreaks, the Russians, they're big fans of advancing through these sort of dense forested areas, so their squads could use it to infiltrate into an area like Dakhne or Krimsky. That's something that is definitely on the table and would present a new vector for the Ukrainians to defend from, which they were not really looking as a possibility of doing beforehand, because now all the resources are tied up in holding the Russians along this one unitary advance. So having another one would, of course, split the Ukrainian resources and put more strain on their logistics coming in from the rear. In terms of the proof that Druzhba was captured, the Russians were able to take 3.8 square kilometers. Let's look at the video. It was released by the 28th Brigade. So you could see here it's from September 3rd. FPV struck a house, caused severe damage to it. And 28th Brigade, it is a Ukrainian unit that was moved away from the Toretsk area around the same time that the Russians actually launched the offensive over there. So I do believe the timing is not a coincidence. It was moved out, and that's when the Russians decided to strike. But now, in a sort of twist of irony, the 28th Brigade has been forced to return to defend in the suburbs of Toretsk because of diversion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, at least one of its battalions, to Kursk. So now the 28th Brigade is split between defending around Kurdyumivka and Rosaryonivka, and also in the region north of Druzhba. To briefly look at Chasiv Yar, this is a part of the front line that has experienced a severe decline in advances since the beginning of the Kursk operation, with both sides withdrawing forces from this area, and it just took really was sent to the back burner. We could see here the Russians were able to advance through 2.1 square kilometers in recent days, with the 98th VDV division reestablishing positions in the Okhtybarsky district. I believe that's what it's called, in eastern Chasiv Yar through some of these houses in the gray zone and getting, of course, positions in their basement areas. So here you can see Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto said Russian soldiers in eastern Chasiv Yar. Just a slight confirmation that the Russians are pushing through some of those initial districts that are less dense in nature. Then at the same time, we have this video from the 81st Air Mobile Brigade from their Apache drone units, where they conducted numerous FPV strikes and drone drops onto Russian forces in fields and a lot of trenches here, because the Ukrainians have built an extensive trench system in the northern approaches of Bilohorivka. And this has been a big part of why the Russians got bogged down here. The Russians do have a really similar elevation to the Ukrainians. When you look at it, they have this huge ridge extending just west of Lysychansk all the way to the north. You'd think that they'd be able to utilize it to their advantage, but then it's sort of canceled out by the Ukrainian heights that are located around Bilohorivka, these various hills either to the south or to the northwest, even going directly to the north. And now the Russians, they're making an effort to storm some of those trenches located atop of those hills, and that's what they did with the advance marked in yellow by taking over those positions. You could even see, using the satellite imagery here, some of these hills, and they really are well defended. And as the Russians advance, even through this small piece of territory, they're of course encountering fierce resistance from the Ukrainian drone squads holding onto Bilohorivka. But taking it over is just the first step in finally closing the entirety of the Seversk axis. For now, it's a rather low priority for the Russian side. Looking at the Kursk offensive, I really do apologize for not covering it in recent days. There was a period with just a lack of information coming out. Whatever information did come out basically just verified my original plotting of the map, and there wasn't any sort of massive update when it came to significant vehicular damage, just very standard drone strikes on either side, shelling, that sort of thing. But we actually have seen some territorial changes occur over the past 24 hours, 48 hours, you could say. And one of them is in Ruskaya Konopelka. So again, I've been warning about this, but you have this one ring of villages that runs along a ravine that the Russians continue to control on the eastern flank of Suja. And the Ukrainians, a part of their operation here, just cleanse any sort of Russian resistance from the entire environs. It would consist of just pushing them out of this one final ring, because this would be the starting point, the genesis of any sort of Russian attempt in the future to retake Suja. So the Ukrainians have to ensure that all of their flanks are prepared, that they have a very strong perimeter to hold on to the one major city they took during this offensive. So they're doing that by infiltrating into Ruskaya Konopelka, and they've done so for over a week now with not large amounts of vehicles involved, but every day a stream of vehicles coming in and taking over more and more territory in the process. And so here we have this video from the Russian side of an FPV strike onto a Ukrainian private vehicle that was advancing through here and was struck. Again, verification that the Ukrainians definitely are active in some of the houses here. And what it means is that they are making an active effort to take it over. The Russians have failed to push them back and have actually lost a large chunk of the village. And the goal of the Ukrainians at this point, based on their other movements, would be to then go in a pincer and take over Pushkarnoy. And at that point, they would have control over most of this really sort of stranded ring of villages, because after that piece of territory that would take over along this red line, there aren't many other Russian populated settlements in the area for reinforcements to arrive at. You have to go like 10 kilometers eastwards to Biryukovka, Kozyrevka, and by then it's much less of an imminent threat to Suja. So that's their goal over here, and they're in the process of enacting it. You could also see that manifestation occur with this geolocation from the side of the Russians, heavy Russian airstrikes and shelling of a forested area and also warehouses of the Ukrainians, probably in Martinovka. So again, you have Ukrainian DRGs and vehicles, small squads dismounting into these really dense forested areas, and in the process getting control over the northern flank of Pushkarnoy, making it all the way to the ravine with the hope of then, of course, meeting up with the garrison and Ruskaya, closing in and taking over this red rectangle that you see marked over here. Now, besides that, we've also seen sort of change in the front line, but one that isn't too egregious in terms of the significance, or not significance, but in terms of the likelihood, I would say. So what I meant to say is that there's been a massive correction in the front line, and this has been coming for a while, because the Russian forces, whatever remnants they have that have remained either in Malaya and Loknaya or were sent in to help those remnants from the Akhmat's 204th Regiment or from any other detachment that I mentioned previously from the Akhmat's or Naval Marines forces. You could see over here that they've been able to hold on to this town, or they had been able, you could say in past tense, to control those positions for a very, very long time. And this was despite the fact that there were, of course, head-on assaults by Ukrainian forces from the 95th Air Assault Brigade, for instance. That's an example. Or from this eastern front where you have Ruskoye Porochnoi, where you do have a Ukrainian frontline hub. Even from the west, this is an area that's much more open in the sense that there are not settlements over here, but just fields and forested areas. And it's just a perfect area for Ukrainian DRGs and for vehicles to roam through. And then some of them take a detour and put pressure onto Mala Luknaya. And so over the past few days, really the pressure from the west has become so significant that the Ukrainians have been able to infiltrate very deep into the Russian line over here from Novoivanovka all the way to this dense forested area located about 10 kilometers northwards and putting pressure onto Pogrebki. Now, this chain of villages that you see over here from, I guess you could say, Semenovka to the north all the way to Malaya Luknaya, it's very transient when it comes to the presence of Russian forces. For instance, you don't have like a permanent Russian hub located over there. A lot of the time you have convoys coming in from deeper in the Russian line in Kursk all the way to Malaya Luknaya, where there actually is a presence because they're trying to defend it. But regarding all the other villages, it's very, very minimal. And so the flank of the Russian forces and the one supply route they have to defend this particular town has been compromised from the beginning. And the Ukrainians did, of course, continue with their harassment attempts for weeks, but only now have they been completely successful in forcing the Russians out with the fear of encircling them within this town. So in the process, the Ukrainians have been able to solidify control over additional towns, including Malaya Luknaya, as we've said a couple of times now, Kruglenkoy, Novaya Sorochina, Orlovka, and Pogrebki, as we said before. What this means is that you have this ravine that all the villages run through, the Ukrainians have access to and could use to advance even deeper into the gray zone towards an area like Levshinka all the way to the north. But also, of course, what I mean to say is that they have all these forested areas in between that can now be used more comfortably, and of course have a field day, utilizing them to then go through the vehicles and push even deeper into the Russian line. But they've been doing much less of these deep 20-kilometer, for instance, infiltrations. The sort of attacks I'm talking about, these sort of infiltration operations, they are much more pinpointed with the goal of forcing the Russians out of a particular region and then actually getting solid control over it. And so in terms of just a natural next target, you can see here this Russian salient that is sort of branching out. And it's not like the Russians have a massive concentration of forces in any of these villages. It's just they send in convoys and are still able to dismount them in an area like Naidenov. And because the Ukrainians have such a presence on all other sides of the front line, then it just seems logical that the Ukrainians will go in and try to close this particular gap in order to create a very solid perimeter for them, at least for a defensive perspective, but also in order to perhaps then push in even deeper as the Russians continue to move in reinforcements to this area. But really, with the hope here, the Russians, of stabilizing the front line, they have not made really active attempts at conducting massive counterattacks. For now, their goal is to at least just contain the Ukrainian attacks as we've reached sort of a standstill. Besides this one correction that I'm talking about, this is a sort of standstill that we're seeing around Korenovo, for instance, or even around the Glushkovo district that appears to have been cut off, but the Russians have since built pontoon bridges that allow them to continue supplying whatever garrison they have in this southern bank of the river.